It's been a long year for towns on the US-Canada border. Hi there, it's Jeff, and this is Plain English lesson number 358. JR is behind the controls, and he posted the full lesson at plainenglish.com/358. Coming up today, they're so close, but so far away. Towns along the US-Canadian border, once so closely knit, are now closed off from one another. Speaking of closely knit, that's the expression that we review today, and I have a quote of the week. So let's get going. The US and Canada share an 8,891-kilometer border, the longest land border between any two nations in the world. In many places, American and Canadian towns operated as one, with families living on both sides of the invisible boundary and residents crossing several times a day for necessities, visiting friends and family, and leisure time activities. But all that ground to a halt when the two nations closed their borders to non-essential traffic when the pandemic hit in March 2020, leaving many communities and even families divided. Derby Line, Vermont, and Stansted, Quebec are two towns that have, over the years, blended into one. The international boundary between the US and Canada runs right down the middle of Rue Canusa. Homes on one side of the street are in Canada, while homes on the other side are in America. Elsewhere, the border weaves through the two towns. It even runs straight through the public library. In normal times, the border isn't freely open. 6 border crossing stations serve the two towns, and residents crossing from one side to the other have to report their crossing. Still, it was common to cross from one side to the other several times a day. Not anymore. Holders of a single passport, US or Canadian, can cross only for narrowly defined essential work. Dual passport holders can cross the border for any reason they like, but they have to quarantine for 14 days upon each crossing. That makes repeated crossings impractical. Businesses, including cafes and hair salons that rely on cross-border traffic, now find their potential markets are cut in half. Many families have some members on one side and other members on the other side of the border. Neighbors on Canusa Street can't talk to one another face to face. One couple got engaged right before the pandemic hit. He lives in Canada while she lives in the US. They can still meet and talk in person. They just have to shout over the yellow tape that divides them. It's a common scene, especially in nicer weather. Families reunite but can't touch. Border Patrol agents supervise the area. Things are even harder at the other extreme of the American-Canadian border. Just 78 people live in the town of Hyder, Alaska. Hyder is 3 miles from the much larger Canadian town of Stewart, British Columbia. Stewart has a population of 400. But here's the catch. Hyder doesn't have a roadway connection to any other town in the United States. The nearest American city is Ketchikan, Alaska, which can only be reached by a 75-mile seaplane flight. The only other way to get to any other town by road is by driving through Canada. The towns are so closely knit that this has never been a problem. The U.S. border is announced by a simple sign on the side of the road. The Canadian government manages a small border services office. The U.S. government doesn't have any border controls at all. From April through September, one person from each family in Hyder was allowed to enter Canada just once per week to buy supplies. It was only in September that the Canadian government relaxed the rules somewhat. Canada now allows residents of Hyder to cross the land border for the necessities of life, their word, not mine, which would include food and medical services. But as we've all learned, essential services can mean different things to different people. The Canadian government specified that border crossings are allowed for groceries, fuel, medical care, or helping family members in need. Recreation and socializing don't count as necessary. And by the way, neither Hyder nor Stewart has had a single case of COVID during the entire pandemic. A more hopeful scene plays out every weekend at Peace Arch State Park in Washington State, in between Seattle and Vancouver. At the park, a century-old gleaming white arch is inscribed with the phrase, "Children of a Common Mother," to signify the close historical bonds between the two countries. But the closed border has divided families and communities here, just as it has back east. The only difference is that Peace Arch State Park is a bit of an exception to the formal border crossing rules. The border is marked by a ditch in the ground, and Canadian residents can cross into the U.S. on foot and visit Peace Arch State Park without going through a formal border crossing. The border is real, and border rules apply. You can't bring goods back from the other side. You have to leave the park in the direction you came. But this is the only place that U.S. and Canadian residents can see each other and touch each other without being subject to quarantine rules. Park rangers say people have driven to the park from thousands of miles away to reunite with family and friends from Canada. America and Canada have been extending the border closures month by month. Neither side has said when the border restrictions would be relaxed. I've never been to a U.S.-Canadian border town. I've driven across the border a few times, but just on the major highways that connect the two countries. But I'm fascinated by these towns that are so close. If you liked this lesson, there are two others you might enjoy. In lesson 200, we talked about the differences between living in the US and Canada. And in lesson 124, we talked about Toronto as a tourist destination. Today's expression is closely knit. Knit is K-N-I-T. It's a verb we use when talking about creating clothes from yarn. You can knit a sweater, knit a warm hat for winter weather, knit a pair of socks, things like that. Picture a grandma and two big needles and a big ball of yarn. That's a stereotype, but not too far off the truth. Today, we mostly buy clothes made in stores, but it's still a traditional gift to knit clothing or a blanket for a newborn in the family. In this expression, though, closely knit, we mean that there are close ties between two people or two groups of people. Some of you may be from closely knit families. If that's you, then you have close relationships with your family and extended family. You do holidays together, but you probably all live in the same region. Cousins are constantly sleeping over. Parents share babysitting duties. Everyone gets together for meals regularly. Parties are common. Something is always going on. The family is closely knit. That's not how it is for everyone. I think in general, you'll find more closely knit families in Latin America, whereas in Europe and the US, our family relationships are not quite as closely knit. They're still good, but not quite as closely knit. We can use this expression for more than families. Think about a small town that has a lot of hometown pride. You could say the community is closely knit. Neighbors know one another. Parents participate in school activities. People volunteer to get things done. Business owners know their customers by name. There are close friendships and relationships in the community. When people need help, others pitch in. Younger people check in on the elderly. The elderly offer sage advice. When someone falls on hard times, others are there to lend a hand. That's a closely knit community. Smaller towns can be described as closely knit, but not every small town is like that. In some small towns, people keep to themselves. Or maybe a small town on the outskirts of a city, everyone's attention is on the big city, not their town. If a town is closely knit, most people's attention is on their own community, and that's where relationships and ties are the strongest. You might describe a church congregation as closely knit if the members of the church have strong personal ties to one another. This is less common, but you can describe a group of friends as closely knit. You would not typically use this to describe a company or coworkers, because it really does imply personal ties. However, I can imagine someone at a small business or a family business saying they have a closely knit group of coworkers. Earlier today, I said that border towns along the US-Canadian border are closely knit. There are border towns that are not closely knit. I'll give you an example. San Diego and Tijuana share a border, but both are big cities in their respective countries. Yes, many people cross the border each day, but the two cities are really big and they're different enough, and the border controls are quite a bit stronger. So I would not describe those two big cities as closely knit. But a small Vermont town and a small Quebec town are closely knit. The border runs right down the middle of a peaceful street. The public library is half in one country and half in another. It's common for families to have members on both sides of the border. Cross-border weddings happen all the time. The border is real and the residents respect it, but crossing is an everyday occurrence. The ties are close. The culture of small towns in that region also contributes to a feeling of a closely knit community. In the early days of American history, the towns in New England states had a form of government called a town meeting. They made decisions together as a community. Some towns still have that tradition. Most have matured a bit, but the civic mindedness endures. Small towns in the west of the U.S. are a bit different. The ethos there is more of individual liberty and freedom and privacy. This is obviously a generality, but in my experience, you'll find more closely knit small towns in the Northeast than you will in the West, due to the history and culture of each region. Today's quote of the week is by the writer Deborah Stone. She's the author of a new book called Counting: How We Use Numbers to Decide What Matters. Part of the book is about what we use numbers and data for in the modern age, and it questions whether we use data and numbers too much. Here's the quote: "To count well, we need to have the humility to know what can't or shouldn't be counted." I thought of that when I was thinking about Hyder, Alaska. There are, of course, solid data-backed reasons to close the US-Canadian border, but sometimes focusing too much on numbers means you lose sight of things that just can't be quantified. You can count cases and deaths on both sides of our national border, but can you really count or quantify the risk of a tiny town of 78 people next to a tiny town of 400? And how much safer is the world really that those 78 people are isolated from all the rest of humanity? Just because a number or metric exists doesn't mean you need to listen to that number or make decisions based on it. I firmly believe that. So here's today's quote once more. from the writer Deborah Stone. To count well, we need to have the humility to know what can't or shouldn't be counted. And that's all for today's lesson. Remember to check out the rest of the full lesson online. The transcripts are there. If you liked the main lesson topic, you'll find links to articles about the 2 border towns we talked about. And if you're a Plain English Plus member, you'll find translations, our video lesson, flashcards, and exercises, all at plainenglish.com/358. Check it out, and we'll be right back here on Thursday. See you then.